The paramedics saw her first. Not the mother, the daughter. She looked 40, but the record said 23. Her skin had the texture of something that had never known sunlight, pale like paper left too long in a drawer. She stood in the doorway, blinking against the afternoon light as if it were made of knives. Behind her, small faces pressed against the darkness. Faces that shouldn't exist. The call had come in as a routine medical emergency. A 19-year-old girl with a severe respiratory infection. But when they arrived at the modest two-story home on Eibstrasse, something felt wrong. The father was too calm, the explanation too rehearsed. And the girl on the stretcher, she didn't know what a car was. "Where have you been?" the lead paramedic asked her gently. She didn't speak. She only pointed down. Down to where the foundation of a normal family home had been hollowed out and rebuilt into something else entirely. Down to where childhood goes to die in silence. Down to a basement that had swallowed a little girl 19 years ago and never let her surface. And when they asked where she'd been for 2 decades, the answer would dismantle everything they thought they knew about the house next door. From the outside, it was a house that blended perfectly into the Austrian town of Amstetten. Neat hedges, clean windows, a man who went to work every day as an electrical engineer, respected in his field, known for his punctuality. Josef Fritzl was 73 years old when the truth emerged. He'd been a husband for decades, a father, a grandfather. He attended family gatherings. He smiled in photographs. The town knew him as stern but unremarkable, the kind of man who kept his lawn trimmed and his opinions to himself. No one knew that beneath his feet, his daughter had been erased from the world. Elisabeth Fritzl disappeared at age 18 in 1984. Not from the streets, not from a parking lot, from her own home. But there was no Amber Alert, no search party, no candlelight vigils or desperate pleas on the evening news. Because Josef had written the story before anyone could ask questions. He told his wife, Rosemarie, and the authorities that Elisabeth had run away to join a cult. He even produced letters he'd forced Elisabeth to write while she was already imprisoned below, explaining that she wanted to be left alone, that she was happy, that no one should come looking. The letters arrived sporadically over the years, always with vague postmarks, always with just enough detail to seem real. Rosemarie believed them. The police believed them. The town moved on. They said it was a tragedy. They were wrong. It was architecture. If you think this ends like every other story, it doesn't. Subscribe now, because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about the people living next door. The ones who wave at you in the morning. The ones whose basements you've never seen. Elisabeth was 18 when her father asked her to help him install a door in the basement. It was August 28, 1984. A summer evening that tasted like ordinary things. Dinner cooling on the stove, siblings arguing upstairs, the hum of a television bleeding through walls. She followed him down. The basement had been under construction for years. Josef had applied for permits, hired contractors for the initial work, then finished the rest himself. Alone. At night. Building a network of rooms that didn't appear on any official blueprint. A hidden space accessible only through a reinforced door concealed behind shelving in the basement workshop. When Elisabeth stepped through that door to help him, Josef shoved a cloth soaked in ether over her face. She woke up chained to a metal pole in a windowless room barely larger than a prison cell. The ceiling was low. The walls were concrete. There was a small bathroom, a kitchenette with a hot plate, and a bed. This was her new world. 600 square feet of fluorescent-lit hell. Josef's rules were immediate and absolute. She would never leave. She would never scream. He'd rigged the door with an electronic lock that only he could open. and he warned her that if she made too much noise, he'd let her starve. She would do what he wanted, when he wanted, and if she obeyed, she'd be fed. The first days were madness wrapped in disbelief. Elisabeth threw herself against the walls until her hands bled. She screamed until her voice became a ragged whisper. She counted the hours by the flickering of the fluorescent tube overhead. But no one came. Upstairs, life continued. Rosemarie cooked dinner. The other children went to school. Josef went to work, came home, watched television. And then, when the house settled into sleep, he would descend into the basement and disappear behind the hidden door. Year 1 became year 5. Year 5 became unknowable. Elisabeth's first pregnancy came within a year of her captivity. She was 19 years old, imprisoned by her own father, and she understood with sickening clarity that this was not a temporary nightmare. This was her life now. She gave birth alone on a filthy mattress with no medical equipment, no painkillers, no help. Josef provided towels and a rudimentary first aid kit. When the baby, a boy, arrived, she held him and made a promise she would repeat 14 more times. "I will keep you alive." Josef took the baby upstairs 3 weeks later. He told Rosemarie that Elisabeth had left the child on their doorstep with a note begging them to raise him. Rosemarie, believing her daughter was still lost to a cult, agreed. They named him Stefan and raised him as their own. 3 more children would follow this pattern over the years. Babies born in darkness, then brought upstairs into the light, adopted by the very man who had fathered them in rape. The authorities asked few questions. Josef's story was consistent. Elisabeth was troubled, unstable, unable to care for her children. But 3 other children were never brought upstairs. They remained in the basement with Elisabeth. Born underground, raised underground, never knowing that a sun existed or that the ceiling wasn't supposed to press down like a fist. Kirsten, Stefan, Felix. They learned to speak in whispers. They learned that the man who visited was called Grandpa, and that he brought food and terrible moods. They learned to read by the light of a single bulb, using books Josef occasionally tossed down like scraps. Elisabeth taught them everything she could remember from her own truncated childhood: math, language, stories, hope. By the time the 7th child was born, she'd stopped counting days, only heartbeats. Josef had engineered more than a prison. He'd engineered silence. The basement was soundproofed with layers of concrete and insulation. The door was reinforced steel, locked electronically, accessible only by a code he changed regularly. He installed a ventilation system that hummed constantly, masking any noise from below. To the outside world, the basement was just a workshop cluttered with tools and electronics. A hobbyist's space, nothing more. Upstairs, Rosemarie never questioned the hours Josef spent in the basement. He told her he was working on projects, building things. She'd learned long ago not to push him, but there were moments when the truth nearly surfaced. Once, a tenant renting a room in the house complained about strange noises, muffled thuds, voices that seemed to come from the walls. Josef evicted him the next week. Another time, a contractor Josef had hired for unrelated repairs noticed an odd configuration in the basement layout. Josef paid him double to finish quickly and forget what he'd seen. The town saw nothing. Neighbors heard nothing. Or perhaps they heard and explained it away. The way people do when confronting the truth requires more courage than ignoring it. Meanwhile, Elisabeth created a life from nothing. She organized the children's days into routines. Lessons in the morning, quiet play in the afternoon, stories before sleep. She rationed the food Josef brought. She kept them clean despite the mold that crept up the walls. She told them about a world beyond the concrete, even though she could barely remember it herself. She was not broken. She was transformed. A woman who'd had her youth stolen became a mother who refused to let her children inherit her despair. But she knew that survival had an expiration date. The ventilation system was failing. The children were getting sick more often. The youngest had never known a day without coughing. She knew one day someone would get sick enough to need help. And when that day came, Josef would have to choose: let them die or risk everything. She waited for that day like a prisoner waits for dawn. It was Kirsten who broke the system. The eldest daughter, 19 years old, born and raised entirely in the basement, had never seen the sky. In April 2008, she collapsed. Her fever spiked to dangerous levels. She convulsed, drifted in and out of consciousness. Her lips turned blue. Elisabeth begged Josef to help her. For days, he did nothing. He brought aspirin, cold compresses, empty reassurances. But Kirsten's condition worsened. Her breathing became shallow. Her skin turned gray. Josef realized that if she died, the body would be evidence. Evidence that couldn't be explained away with letters or lies. So he made a choice. He told Elisabeth to write a note, another one of the cult letters, this time explaining that Kirsten was gravely ill and needed help, but that Elisabeth herself couldn't come to the hospital. Then he brought Kirsten upstairs, placed her unconscious body in his car, and drove to the hospital with Rosemarie. The story he told the doctors was the same one he'd been telling for years. Elisabeth had abandoned her daughter on their doorstep with a desperate note. But this time, the doctors didn't just nod and move on. Kirsten's condition was critical. She'd slipped into a coma. The medical team needed detailed information about her medical history, her early childhood, her mother's health during pregnancy, information Josef couldn't provide. They issued a public plea. If Kirsten's mother is out there, please come forward. Your daughter is dying. We need you. The plea aired on national television. It appeared in newspapers. It spread across Austria like wildfire. And in the basement, Elisabeth saw it on the small television Josef had installed years ago to keep her compliant and quiet. She saw her daughter dying. She saw the world asking for her. Josef, panicked by the media attention, made his final miscalculation. He brought Elisabeth to the hospital, coaching her on what to say, believing he could still control the narrative. But the moment Elisabeth emerged into the daylight, pale and trembling and clearly traumatized, a nurse looked into her eyes and knew. The doctor asked to see her ID. She didn't know what that was. Most people would scroll past stories like this. That's exactly how this kept happening for years. Behind ordinary doors, in ordinary towns. Don't be one of them. Subscribe so you don't stay silent when silence is what predators count on. Because the doors on your street look just like his did. When police descended on 40 Yibstrasse on April 26, 2008, they thought they were investigating a case of long-term missing person. They had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most shocking crimes in modern history. Josef Fritzl confessed almost immediately. Not out of remorse, but because he knew the game was over. He led investigators to the hidden basement entrance, punched in the code, and opened the door. What they found was a tomb for the living. The basement consisted of a narrow corridor leading to several small rooms, a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchenette, a small washroom. The ceilings were barely 5.5 feet high. The air was stale and thick with moisture. Mold bloomed in black patches across the walls. The only light came from flickering fluorescent tubes. And in those rooms, police found 3 children. Stefan, 18 years old, Felix, 5, and a daughter, age 6, whose name was later revealed as Lena. They cowered in the corners, blinking against the flashlights, terrified of the strangers in uniforms. Stefan, the oldest, could barely speak. He'd never had a real conversation with anyone except his mother and siblings. None of them had ever seen sunlight. Officers wept. Hardened investigators stepped outside to compose themselves. One detective later said, I've worked homicides, trafficking cases, things that would turn your stomach. But this was evil with patience. The forensic team documented everything. Elisabeth's makeshift calendar scratched into the wall, drawings the children had made on scraps of paper, a diary Elisabeth had kept, chronicling the years in careful handwriting that devolved into desperate scrawls during the worst times. They found evidence of the children who hadn't survived. 2 infants, twins, had died shortly after birth. Josef had incinerated their bodies in the house's furnace. 15 pregnancies over 19 years, 7 surviving children, 3 raised upstairs as adoptees, 3 trapped below, 2 buried in ash. Josef had stolen his daughter's life, then built an entire second family in the grave he'd made for her. But the revelation that shattered the community came next. Rosemarie Fritzl insisted she didn't know. For 19 years, she'd lived in the house, cooked meals, cleaned rooms, raised 3 of Elisabeth's children as her own. She'd watched Josef disappear into the basement for hours every evening and never asked why. Investigators struggled to believe her. How do you not know? How do you not hear? How do you not sense? But the truth about complicity is that it rarely announces itself. It hides in willful ignorance, in the belief that asking questions might unravel a life you're too tired to rebuild. Rosemarie was never charged with a crime. The courts determined there was insufficient evidence she'd known about the basement. But public opinion was less forgiving. Some saw her as a victim of Josef's manipulation and abuse. Others saw her as a woman who chose comfort over curiosity. The adopted children, the 3 who'd grown up upstairs, faced their own devastation. They'd been raised by Josef as grandchildren, never knowing he was their biological father, never knowing their siblings existed just beneath their feet. One of them, Stefan, the first child Josef had taken upstairs, later described the revelation as learning that my entire life was a lie built on top of a nightmare. And the town of Amstetten, population 23,000, had to confront an unbearable question. How many of us walked past that house and never wondered? The mailman who delivered letters, the neighbors who borrowed tools from Josef's garage, the children who played in the yard while 3 others rotted below. A detective assigned to the case said it plainly during a press conference. This wasn't hidden. It was ignored. We ignore what we don't want to see. And sometimes, what we ignore devours people whole. Josef Fritzl's trial began in March 2009 in St. Pölten, Austria. He faced multiple charges: false imprisonment, rape, incest, enslavement, and the negligent homicide of one of the twin infants who died due to lack of medical care. He arrived in court shielding his face from cameras, but the world had already seen enough. The trial was closed to protect the victims, but details leaked. Prosecutors presented Elisabeth's testimony, hours of recorded interviews describing the abuse, the pregnancies, the despair. She spoke in a flat, emotionless tone, the voice of someone who'd survived by shutting parts of herself down. Josef showed no remorse. He claimed he'd been protecting Elisabeth from a troubled life, that he'd provided for her, that he loved her. The prosecution dismantled his lies with forensic precision. The soundproofed rooms, the electronic locks, the letters he'd forced her to write. The infants burned in the furnace. On March 19, 2009, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge called him a cold, calculating criminal who violated every boundary of human decency. Austria, a nation that prided itself on civility and order, reeled. How does a person become this? The psychiatrists who evaluated Josef found him sane. Not a madman driven by delusion, but a man who'd methodically chosen cruelty. There was no comfort in that diagnosis. Madness can be treated. Evil, it seems, is simply a choice repeated until it becomes a routine. Elisabeth and her children were taken to a secure psychiatric facility designed specifically for their recovery. The clinic, Mauer Oling, became their new home, a place where therapists, doctors, and counselors worked around the clock to help them relearn the world. The children raised in the basement struggled the most. Stefan, 18, had the bone density of an elderly man. His muscles had never developed properly. He couldn't walk more than a few steps without exhaustion. Sunlight hurt his eyes. Open spaces triggered panic attacks. Felix and Lena, the younger two, had developmental delays. They'd never played with other children, never tasted fresh fruit, never heard music that wasn't muffled through concrete. Therapists used play therapy, art, and gradual exposure to help them adjust. But there were moments of heartbreak. Felix crying because the sky was too big. Lena refusing to sleep without the sound of a humming ventilation system because silence felt wrong. The three children raised upstairs, Monica, Alexander, and the eldest Stefan, faced a different kind of trauma. They had to reconcile their memories of a loving grandfather with the monster who'd enslaved their mother. Some struggled with guilt. How could we not have known? But Elisabeth refused to let her children drown in what had been done to them. She spent hours with them every day. She took walks with them in the facility's gardens, holding their hands as they learned that grass was soft and flowers had scents. She read to them, not from memory this time, but from real books with glossy pages. And slowly, impossibly, they began to heal. One therapist recalled a moment that stayed with her. Elisabeth was sitting with Felix in the garden. He picked a dandelion and asked what it was. She told him. Then he asked, "Can I keep it?" And she said, "You can keep anything you want now." He cried. She cried. I cried. In 2009, Elisabeth gave her first and only statement to the public through her lawyer. "I am now in a position to let people know that my children are doing well. We are learning to live again. That is all I wish to say." Austria granted them new identities. Their location was kept secret. The media agreed not to publish photos of the children. They vanished into anonymity, not because they were hiding, but because they were finally free. The Fritzl case forced uncomfortable conversations across Austria and beyond. How had social services failed so completely? Why had no one questioned the sudden appearance of 3 abandoned children? Why had no one demanded to see Elisabeth in person? Government inquiries revealed systemic failures. Overworked caseworkers, inadequate follow-up procedures, a culture that deferred too easily to patriarchal authority. Josef Fritzl had exploited every crack in the system. But the deeper question haunted communities everywhere. How many other basements are there? In the years following the case, similar stories emerged. In Cleveland, Ohio, Ariel Castro imprisoned 3 women for over a decade. In California, Philip Garrido kept J.C. Dugard captive for 18 years. Each case revealed the same pattern. Ordinary-looking houses, neighbors who saw nothing, systems that failed. The Fritzl house on Eibstrasse was eventually sold. The new owners sealed the basement with concrete. But sealing it didn't erase it. Local residents still avoid the street. Children are told not to play near the property. Some people claim the house feels wrong, like a wound that never healed. And in quiet moments, people in Amstetten still ask themselves, what didn't we see? What didn't we want to see? Because the most terrifying truth about the Fritzl case isn't that it happened. It's that it happened in plain sight. In a town with schools and churches and neighborhoods where people smiled at each other in the grocery store. This didn't happen in the dark. It happened in daylight, behind a door no one knocked on. If Elisabeth's story shook you, don't just move on. Subscribe so her voice doesn't fade into another forgotten headline. And if you won't, at least tell us why in the comments. Maybe silence has its reasons, or maybe it's just easier. But remember, every time we choose easy, someone else pays the price in years they'll never get back. Elisabeth is believed to be in her mid-50s now, living under a new identity in an undisclosed location in Austria. Reports suggest she's remained close to her children, though the family fiercely guards their privacy. Some of the children have reportedly integrated into society, holding jobs, forming relationships, living lives that resemble normalcy. Others still struggle with the psychological aftermath, the kind of trauma that doesn't heal so much as learn to coexist with the person carrying it. Stefan, the eldest son raised in the basement, has had the hardest road. His health remains fragile, but according to one unconfirmed report, he once told a therapist, "I'm alive. That's something my father never thought I'd be able to say." The children raised upstairs have had to navigate a world that knows their story. Some have changed their names multiple times. Some have left Austria entirely. Josef Fritzl remains in prison, now in his late 80s. He's applied for parole multiple times. Each time, he's been denied. Austrian law allows him to keep trying. Elisabeth has never visited him. She's never written to him. According to her lawyer, she's spoken his name only once since her rescue, during her testimony. After that, she referred to him only as he, or the man. She plants flowers now, according to one unverified account. Each spring, 15 of them. One for each child. One for each year stolen. One for each reason to keep breathing when breathing felt impossible. The basement still exists. Somewhere beneath layers of concrete and new flooring, the rooms remain. The scratches on the walls, the low ceilings, the fluorescent lights that flickered for 19 years. Some doors, once opened, are never fully closed. The Fritzl case isn't just a story about one family's nightmare. It's a mirror held up to all of us. It asks, what are we willing to ignore? What signs do we explain away because confronting them would disrupt our comfort? We walk past 1,000 closed doors every day. Apartments, houses, basements. We hear arguments through walls and tell ourselves it's none of our business. We see bruises and accept the explanations. We notice children who seem too quiet and convince ourselves they're just shy. And most of the time, we're right. Most doors hide nothing but ordinary lives. But some doors hide Elisabeth, and the children who were never supposed to exist, and the women who are screaming right now into soundproofed walls, hoping someone, somewhere, will care enough to listen. Josef Fritzl didn't do this alone. He had accomplices. Indifference, assumption, the collective agreement that what happens behind closed doors should stay there. He had the silence we're all guilty of when we choose not to see. Elisabeth survived not because the system saved her, but because her daughter got sick enough that Josef's need to avoid a corpse outweighed his need for secrecy. She survived by accident. How many others aren't that lucky? But if you think this case was the darkest one we've covered, 3 miles from that basement in a house that looks just like any other, investigators found something that made even seasoned detectives walk out. We'll tell you about it next, because the monsters aren't finished, and neither are we.